Hello from Brooklyn Tweed. Today we are talking about bobbles, which are a fun textured cluster of stitches on the surface of your knitting. And you can add these to any sort of knitted fabric that you're making, whether you're doing stockinette or garter stitch. And there are several different ways to create bobbles. You're basically building a little cluster of stitches that grow out of one stitch and then gathering them back together at the top to create these little balls of knitting in your work. So the first bobble technique that I will show you is a stockinette stitch bobble. And this is a bobble that we use in our first cables hat pattern. So you can see the little rows of bobbles traveling up the hat. Nice fun little addition to your knitted fabric. So let's do that one first. The way that we're going to start our stockinette bobble is when we reach the stitch that we want to work our bobble in, we're going to knit into this stitch, leave the stitch on the left-hand needle, bring our yarn forward, purl into that same stitch, still leave the stitch on the left-hand needle, take our yarn to the back, and knit into the stitch once more, and then slide it off. We've now created 3 stitches in that one stitch. And you can make bobbles with any number of stitches. This particular bobble uses 3. You may see bobbles with 5 stitches, 7 stitches. Just depends on how plump you want to make your particular bobble. So I've created the first row of my bobble. I'm now going to turn my work and work back across. I'm going to slip the first stitch of my bobble and then purl the next 2 stitches. I'm on the purl side of my stockinette fabric, so I'll work purl stitches to stay in my stockinette pattern. Once I've purled across my bobble stitches, I'm going to turn back to the front again, slip the first stitch of my bobble, knit the next 2 stitches, as I'm now on the knit side of my fabric. And our bobble is starting to grow there, you can see. One more time to the back, slip that first stitch to the right needle, purl the next 2 stitches, and back to the front. So now we've created this little cluster of stitches, and we want to close our bobble off at the top so that we can move on to the rest of our fabric. So the way that we will do that is we are going to slip that first stitch once more. We'll knit the next 2 stitches together, and then we'll pass that stitch that we slipped back over the stitch that we just knitted. And now we have a complete bobble. So let's go ahead and work our way over and do another one. All right, so here's our next bobble. We're just stacking our bobbles up right on top of each other. So again, we're going to knit, purl, knit, all into the same stitch to start off our bobble. Turn to the back, slip our first stitch, work our next 2 stitches in pattern, which in this case is a purl. Back to the front, slip, knit, knit, back to the back, slip, purl, purl, and back to the front to close off our bobble. Slip that first stitch, knit 2 together, and pass the slipped stitch over. Sometimes they get away from you. And then you've got your complete bobble. We'll work over here and do a couple more. And you can change how your bobbles look a little bit by changing the number of stitches that are between your bobbles. You can have your bobbles closer together or farther apart. You can change the number of rows that are between your bobbles vertically, so your bobbles can be stacked closer together or farther apart. Or you could stagger your bobbles so that instead of being in straight up and down rows, maybe they're going diagonally. You can put bobbles anywhere that you like in your knitting. Since they're only growing out of one stitch, really the possibilities for adding them into any kind of fabric that you're knitting are endless. So here we go. We've knit, purl, knit into our bobble stitch. Turn to the back, slip, purl, purl, back to the front, slip, knit, knit. One more time to the back, slip, purl, purl, and back to the front to close off our bobble. Slip that first stitch, knit two together, and pass the slip stitch over. We'll do one more just to finish out our row. By now you're probably bobble pros. So together we'll knit, purl, knit into the first stitch, turn our work, slip, purl, purl, turn our work, slip, knit, knit, slip, purl, purl, and back to the front to finish our bobble. Slip, knit two together, and close off the top of your bobble by passing that slip stitch over. Knit to the end of our row, and we have got a happy little row of bobbles in our knitting. So that is our stockinette bobble, and you can find that in our first cables hat pattern in the pattern companion if you want to add some bobbles to your knitting. And try it just on any kind of fabric that you happen to be knitting. If you've got a plain stockinette pattern, throw a few bobbles in there and see how it looks. Okay, so the next bobble that I'm going to show you is a garter stitch bobble. So for this, we're working our bobbles and knitting both sides of our fabric. So it gives a little bit different look. And these bobbles are clustered a little bit closer together than our last ones, and they're also diagonally offset in each row. So you get a nice happy little cluster of bobbles, all nestling closely together. And you can see these garter stitch bobbles in patterns like our Balin cardigan, where you've got this lovely diamond of garter stitch bobbles all clustered together to form this really wonderful texture on your fabric in between your cables and panels of seed stitch that are going on here. So it just creates a really fun textured look on your fabric. So let's learn how to do those. So these are very easy because you don't have to purl. You're just knitting on every side. Okay, so let's work some garter stitch bobbles. So we're going to work over to where we want to start our first bobble. So in this case, I want to make a bobble that lines up with this guy down here. So here's my bobble stitch that I'm going to work into. So for my garter stitch bobble, I'm going to knit into my stitch, keep that stitch on my left hand needle, and I'm going to yarn over, knit into the stitch again, yarn over again, and knit into the stitch one last time. So now I have 5 stitches on my needle, and I can slip that first bobble stitch off. So I'm going to be making a 5-stitch bobble this time to make it a little bit chunkier and plump for a nice happy little bobble. So I've got my 5 stitches. I'm going to turn to the back of my work, and I'll just knit across these stitches because we're working garter stitch. So we're knitting both sides of our fabric. So this side is very easy. Then I'll come back to the front. There's my 5 little stitches. And I'm going to close off the top of my bobble. This is a short little bobble. So only 3 rows in this bobble. So to close off my bobble, I'm going to knit my first 2 stitches together. And then I'm going to slip this stitch back to my left-hand needle. And then I will pass these next 3 stitches over the top of that knit 2 together stitch. And that will close off my bobble. So let's try that once more. So I'll knit over a few more stitches and work that bobble again. So I go in, knit 1 stitch into my bobble stitch, leave that stitch on the left-hand needle, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 1, until I have 5 stitches on my needle. And I can slip that stitch off my left-hand needle. Turn to the back, knit across those 5 stitches, turn back to the front, and close my bobble off. I'll knit those first 2 stitches together, and then slip that stitch back to the left-hand needle, and then pass the next 3 stitches over to finish my bobble. Okay, and that is how we knit our garter stitch bobbles. Okay, so our last bobble that I'm going to show you is a crocheted bobble. So for this one, we'll be using our knitting needles and a crochet hook. And this gives you sort of a very loopy appearance to your bobble. And you can see these in patterns like our back bay sweater, where we've got just this one little row of bobbles that's setting off our cable patterns, just to add a little bit more texture and interest to our design. So let's see how to do that. Okay, so to work our crocheted bobble, On this swatch, I'm doing my crocheted bobbles on a field of purl stitch. So I'm purling across the right side and knitting across the back, just for a little visual interest. Okay, so here's where I want to work my crocheted bobble. So I'm going to take my crochet hook, and to create your crocheted bobbles, you want to use a crochet hook that's one size smaller than your knitting needles. That'll help you get all of your loops worked for your bobble without getting stuck. So I'm going to take my stitch that I want to work my bobble in, and I'm going to slip that onto my crochet hook. And I will just yarn over and draw that through my stitch. And then I will chain 2. So yarn over again, draw that through, yarn over again, draw that through. And you want to keep your crochet stitches here pretty nice and loose so that you can manipulate all of the loops that you're going to have in your bobble. So now that I've given myself a little height to work with here with my crochet chain, now I'm going to form my bobble loops. So I'm going to yarn over. I'm going to go back into my original bobble stitch, yarn over again, and pull through just that stitch. So I now have 3 loops on my hook. I'm going to do that again. Yarn over. My yarn over has escaped. Yarn over. Go back into the stitch. Yarn over again. Pull through just the stitch. So I now have 5 loops on my hook. And I'm going to go one more time. Yarn over. Into the stitch. Yarn over and pull through the stitch. So I now have 7 loops on my crochet hook. Again, I want to make sure these loops are a little bit loose for my next step here. So now I've created all of my bobble loops, and now I want to close off that bobble at the top. So I'm going to do that by making one more yarn over, and I'm going to pull that yarn over through all 7 loops on my hook. And there we are. Then I'll yarn over one last time and pull through to fasten off my bobble. And then I can take my crochet hook out and just slide my bobble onto my right needle. So there's one crochet bobble. So let's do that one more time. So I'm going to work across my fabric to the spot where I want my next bobble to be. And sometimes your bobbles like to try to hide on the back, so you can just poke them through to the front. And we'll work our crocheted bobble again. So we're going to take our bobble stitch and slide that onto our crochet hook. Yarn over and chain 2. So there's 1, there's 2, and then we form our bobble loops. So yarn over, go back into your bobble stitch, yarn over again, pull through the stitch so that you've got 3 loops on your crochet hook, yarn over again, back through your stitch, yarn over, pull through your stitch. Now you have 5 loops, and one last time, yarn over, into your stitch, yarn over again, and pull through till you have 7 loops. Fasten that off with one last yarn over, that you're going to pull through all 7 loops, and then yarn over and draw through one last time to fasten off your crochet bobble. And that is all there is to it. Just gives you a little bit different look to your bobble. You've got your crocheted loops running kind of horizontally across your bobble. So it really gives you more of a bundle of yarn kind of appearance to your bobble as opposed to some of the other methods. So it just depends on what texture you like and what you want to put into your knitted fabric.